Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this event. My name is Nazia Hussain. I work at the Institute of Future Initiatives, and we're going to talk about governance in cities in Latin America and Africa. Before we begin, I would request the director of my center to introduce himself and say a few words.
Thank you, Nazia, and thank you for joining our workshop today. Understanding the nature of governance in cities. This is one of the series of events that Dr. Hussain has been organizing, basically focusing on city, the politics, the social issues involved, global implications, reaching out to various directions. The Institute for Future Initiatives is a sort of a think tank inside our university, the University of Tokyo. Researchers have their own agenda. They want to answer questions that are related to their curiosity, but nonetheless we do have to deliver to the society our findings and show that what we're doing is relevant to the society. So with that in mind, we started Policy Alternative Research Institute, PRI, 11 years ago. And then we merged with an institution that focuses on sustainability last year. And that's the origin of IFI. So we cover a wide terrain. And thankfully, because 17 broad subjects are covered in the UN proposal for SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, somehow we successfully could justify various focus, making use of the SDGs perspective. The other thing I'd like to highlight is that we pay great attention to what people call area studies. My background is international studies and Southeast Asian studies. And I do think that an in-depth understanding of each region in the world is extremely relevant when we wish to answer broad questions. It's not a question of choice, whether we should choose theory or area. We need both. And I think we've been doing that with great success, if I may say so far. So back to you, Nazia. I can't go on with this propaganda here.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I would encourage everyone to take a look at the detailed bios of our speakers on our website. And for the purposes of time management, I will briefly introduce both of them. Dr. Markus Shultze-Kraft works and teaches on violent conflict prevention and resolution, peacemaking and peace building, security sector reform, organized crime, governance, international drug policy, and inclusive development in Latin America, West Africa, and the Western Balkans. He holds a PhD in politics from Oxford University. And then we have Dr. Jeffrey Peller, whose research and teaching focuses on African politics and sustainable urban development and practices of democracy and accountability in urban Africa. He has conducted fieldwork in Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa. And he holds a PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So the format is as follows. I will briefly talk about a talk for 5 minutes, and then I will invite Dr. Shultze-Kraft to talk about governance in Latin America, followed by Dr. Jeffrey Peller. And the last 30 minutes will be reserved for the Q&A. So with that, we're off to the races. And let me just share my screen. So basically today we are going to talk about the nature of governance in cities and in Latin America and Africa. And it's such a big, diverse concept. So let me just briefly walk you through why we're doing this. And for that, I will give you first the macro trends which are taking place in the world. The first being that while the number of wars has gone down, conflict within states has gone up. And within these trends, we have Within cities, we see this, that in cities in Latin America, we have 43 of the 50 most violent cities are in Latin America. And then cities are also the theater of war in the Middle East. So within these big trends, we see the trends in the cities. Then we also have climate change going on, droughts, wildfires, gradual changes, big changes, all of those contributing to social and political stresses throughout the world. And then lastly, we also have migration. In 2017, the largest number of people ever recorded in human history, around 68.5 million people migrated. 2/3 of them displaced by conflict and 1/3 by extreme weather events. And according to UN estimates, by 2050, 1 in every 45 people will have moved or will be moving. So within these macro trends, now let's hone into the urban futures, which is why we're here. And here you see that although Latin America and the Caribbean have been urbanizing over the past years, now Africa and Asia are taking precedence. And so there's a lot to learn from Latin America for Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, which unfortunately doesn't feature up much, but is there nonetheless. So the question then, keeping in view these macro trends and urban futures, I want to come back to now the analytical challenges that we're facing as scholars. Because as these trends are unfolding in the world, as scholars, we are catching up. And the first question is that, one of the questions people ask is, are these trends going to lead to protests, social unrest, and so on? But I kind of turn the question on its head and I say the question is not just that, it is how are they going to interact with pre-existing ground realities in many cities? And keep in mind, these are cities in different regions. Middle East has its own dynamics, so does Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And then when we keep this in mind, then the answer is easy enough. There are no easy answers. There's no consensus among scholars. Because if in a city, crime and violence is shaping governance and daily life, then how do we distill the effects of depleting resources, climate change, or inflow of migrants and refugees in these places? And my solution is that in addition to the particularist approaches, that is geographers studying urban issues, criminologists studying crime, and so on, they should be complemented with multidisciplinary perspectives, because this is the coming together of different trends. So we need to combine approaches. And then we need to see how politics of people and politics of the elite are interacting in response to these challenges. And I believe that these answers may lead to broader understanding of the dynamics of violence and conflict and contentious politics that we looked at in that big picture in the very first slide. And from that, I choose governance today. We talk about governance because governance presents a powerful lens to make sense of this complexity of urban experiences that both the speakers will talk about. And when we think of governance, because of the easy, in common usage now, we talk about good governance. So we think it's an intuitive idea, state providing services. But theory tells us that it's not a straightforward concept as we may think. It is about steering and coordination, or lack of it, among different players, including governments. But also it's a window in the processes of state formation. We have to remember that different countries gain independence at different times. So state formation processes may not look the same in every country. And then you have to keep in mind post-colonial baggage, the histories of colonization that shaped the way people thought about governments, the way people were divided into citizens and subjects, and so on. So it's really complicated and not just a simple idea. And I call it governance with adjectives. I'm sure other people have mentioned this as well. And basically, the simple idea is that we pay attention to varying patterns of governance in different contexts. and then possibly identify generalizable mechanisms. Because we cannot just focus on differences, we have to find common patterns. At least that's how we're trained as political scientists, so that's the goal. With this very brief overview, now I will take you to the most important slide. Thank you for listening to me. And I will now invite Dr. Shultze-Kraft to talk about Latin America.
Thank you very much, Nazia. Thanks much for the invitation, the kind invitation, also to the Institute of Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. It's a real honor to be here with you early this morning in Berlin. I will talk about metropolitan governance in contemporary Latin America, and I will be talking particularly about the issue of what I call criminality. I will take you into that realm of criminality in a second. So let me put on my screen and share my presentation with you for everyone to see. So, metropolitan governance in contemporary Latin America, the challenge of criminality. As Nazia already pointed out, Latin America is at the forefront of urbanization trends, or has been at the forefront of urbanization trends in the last 50 years or so. So what I would like to do this morning or this afternoon and evening, depending on the time zone, is to first take a brief look at urbanization in Latin America, some basic facts, and then go on to look at the challenges of big city governance in Latin American contexts. And third, look at urban governance innovation that has taken place in the region in the last few decades. And fourth, then delve into the issue of criminal governance and urban planning in Cali as an example. I should say here that I have lived in Cali for 5 years before relocating to Germany last year. So I have a pretty much grounded perspective on what has been going on in a city such as Cali in terms of governance and also criminality. And I shall finalize with a brief outlook. So let's look at urbanization in Latin America. Well, it has been nothing but monumental in the past 50 years or longer. We have seen the emergence of several megacities in Latin America across the continent, from Mexico City down to Buenos Aires in Argentina, and Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and in the Andean rim, Bogota and Lima. All of these cities today are estimated to be well beyond or at 10 million inhabitants. So these are huge urban sprawls that have been emerging across the continent. More than 80% of the population of Latin America today lives in urban centers and areas. In some countries such as Venezuela, but also Uruguay and Chile, this actually is rising to 90 or even above 90%. And more than 60% of Latin America's GDP, gross domestic product, is generated in cities today. So what has historically been in Latin America a rather deep divide between the city and the countryside has become certainly more accentuated in the past decades. Hence, there is still today an issue that I call the Janus-phased condition of the Latin American city. So on the one hand, they are centers of wealth generation, certainly of political power, communications, scientific and technological advancement, and also cultural life. But at the same time, they are sites for abject poverty, inequality, environmental degradation, insecurity, and violent crime. Violent crime, I should add, not only committed by criminal organizations, by the criminal, so-called criminal underworld, but certainly also by an array of different state actors. So the the general picture of urbanization in Latin America is certainly characterized by a high degree of complexity, and there are many, many challenges associated with the governance of great cities, big cities in Latin America. These challenges are derived in good part from that Janus face condition of the Latin American city. So the development hub versus the poverty trap and violent state crime arena issue that I just mentioned. I think this is sort of at the center of the urban governance challenge if you're looking for a very brief characterization in Latin America today. I should like to say that, of course, I can't go into this today, but I should like at least to mention it. There are significant issues also in relation to the how do big cities relate to their immediate and remoter spatial environment. So there are, for example, the big issues about metropolitan areas and metropolitan governance, that is big cities, sprawling out into the adjacent areas and regions, such as in Bogota and in all of the big cities in Latin America. This is a situation. And we have significant issues of governance ambiguity, of coordination problems, etc., between the center of the city, as it were, and its adjacent areas. And of course, then there is the other dimension, which is land flight, which is people living in the countryside, going to the cities, leaving for the city in big numbers. In a place such as Colombia, this has in the past 20, 30 years been accentuated a great deal by the armed conflict, which is mostly the armed conflict between the insurgents, mostly formerly also paramilitaries, and the government forces. This kind of political armed conflict has been taking place in the countryside rather than the cities. So I just wanted to say, when we look at the big city issues and the challenges of governance in urban areas in Latin America, we should not lose sight of other relationships that exist between the city and its environment, spatial and social, and in other forms. These big cities are characterized by profound socio-spatial fragmentation, segregation, and exclusion. Some authors and analysts have referred to this situation as the fragile city. So Latin America is seeing, thus the argument, the rise not only of fragility at the national, political, and institutional level, but also at the subnational, local, city level. So there's talk about the fragile city. And it has also been asked whether actually the current big Latin American city is a kind of countermodel to the traditional city, precisely because of issues related to fragility, which mean basically there are significant deficits in authority, there are deficits in capacity, and there are deficits in legitimacy of the exercise of public authority or political authority in cities in Latin America, which means that, for example, and I do know the story well, in a large city, almost 3 million inhabitants, such as Cali in Colombia, there are no sidewalks, or at least a very limited number of sidewalks only. So the only way you can actually go about mobilizing across the city, going to work, going to the university, taking your kid to school, is by jumping into the car and getting yourself, into a big traffic jam on your different journeys and errands across the city. So there is, in some, the perception among observers and analysts that actually the city in Latin America, particularly the big city, is so fragmented and segregated and also so exclusionary that it can't actually be called a city, because a city means convergence. It means that people and sectors, different sectors, are social sectors, professional sectors, etc., are interacting, engaging with each other, but in Latin America, this is often not the case. So fragility combined or expressed in the lack of cityhood, if you wish, is an observation that has been made, and I think it is quite pertinent. This goes hand in hand, in a way, with what could be called bloated, ambiguous, and non-cooperative administrative structures in big Latin American cities. So it often is not clear who is responsible for what in terms of public service delivery, for example, security provision, and so on, and who is accountable to whom. There is a mayor, yes, again, referring to the case of Colombia, which is the one I know best. The city mayors in Colombia are the authorities in terms of command over the police, but the police is a national police. So, for example, one doesn't quite know how the mayor relates to the national government in terms of providing security in his or her city. And at the same time, also, it is not quite clear to whom police are accountable in a city such as Cali. Because they are national in constitution and as such actually do report to the Ministry of Defense at the national level and not necessarily to the mayor at the local level. So there are these issues. Others that I have already referred to briefly are metropolitan area issues. So who is responsible for garbage recollection in an adjacent municipality very close to a big city, which often is the case. There are basically fights over competencies and who pays for these services. So the provision of public goods and basic services, clean environment, citizen security, public transport, education, health, and others, these are the problem areas, if you wish, of governance in big cities in Latin America. And we can't go into depth here, but on a general level, I think it can be said, and I shall turn to the innovations and efforts that have been made to address the issues. But at a general level, I think it is possible to say that on all these fronts, the clean environment, the citizen security, public transport, education, health, cities in the region have been falling short of aspirations. Let me go and look at very briefly at what has been attempted in the past decades, since the 1980s basically, in terms of dealing with these big challenges to big city governance in Latin America. Well, there has been the trend towards political, administrative, and fiscal decentralization. Among this is the first-time election of mayors in a country such as Colombia in 1986, which was then enshrined in the 1991 Constitution. This is one example among many across the region where decentralization has been attempted in order to bring services and goods closer to citizens, to increase the possibilities of accountability, to increase citizen participation in policy making, or at least in thinking about policy making. This is reflected in participatory budgeting initiatives. The most known one is the one in Porto Alegre in Brazil, but it has also been attempted and is something that has been done in Medellin in Colombia, for example, and in other cities. So again, the idea behind participatory budgeting has been, well, we need citizen oversight of how public finances are allocated, and we need better accountability of these budgeting and implementation processes at the local level. There have been public-private partnerships for public service provision. Famous here is the Transmilenio bus rapid transit system in Bogota, which exists also which actually originated in a city in Brazil and has been implemented in other big urban areas across the region, be it in Quito, be it also in Santiago and other places. Cali has its own MIO system today. So these are public-private partnerships where it is not only the state who, the local government or even the national state who would provide this service, but it is being done in different formats in cooperation with private enterprises. So this is part of what some would call probably the neoliberal trend in governance innovation in Latin America. Big infrastructure developments such as cable cars in Cali and Medellin that try to connect inner city areas without outlying, often mountainous slum areas. So they build in cable cars that are actually well functioning and are very nice to use. I have been using those with my family sometimes. So again, it is to connect people. It is connect people, across geographic, topographical divides that characterize many Latin American cities, and it is also about connecting people socially and in terms of work, making it easier for people to go and work and get to their workplaces. Proximity policing in terms of security provision has been an important element too in several Latin American cities, Plan Cuadrante in Colombia and in Salvador, the precincts in Guatemala, for example, the police precincts, all of that has been geared towards, getting the police in closer contact with local populations, creating trust and overcoming, deep-seated fears of, police violence and abuse of power and human rights violations and so on and so forth. And finally, just as an example, this is not an exhaustive list, the gang truces in San Salvador, for example, where, in order to get a grip on these enormously difficult situations of large urban gangs, maras operating in particularly Central America, but also other parts of Latin America. The Iron Fist strategy didn't really work, to my mind, not surprisingly, because you can't just fill up the, in any case, inadequate prisons with Mara members who continue to organize and operate from there. So truces have been negotiated. They are disputed in terms of their effectiveness. A brief overview of what has been tried in terms of urban governance innovation and improvements in big Latin American urban areas and cities in the past 20, 30 years. Let me now take you into the realm of criminal legality, because I think it is a perspective that I have been developing with a base in Colombia, a long-time base. Before my time at the Universidad ICESI in Cali, I served with the International Crisis Group based in Bogota. So I have a long history of working actually from the region, on the region. And during my, work there and my innumerable interactions with political and social and other actors, I found that there is the issue of governance in Latin America, in a country such as Colombia, but also in a country such as Mexico, certainly in countries such as El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras, but also Venezuela in a different way, and Bolivia and Peru, basically across the region. Governance cannot be understood without reference to the legality that exists in a given country or city, the legal base, the constitutional legal base, and illegality, criminality, which is capable actually of generating its own kind of norms and even laws, if you wish, unofficial laws that structure interactions between different political, economic, and social groups in cities and countries in Latin America. To this effect, I have devised what I call the criminal legality, criminal legitimacy spectrum, which you see here on the screen. It is just simply two arrows. One is the axis legality to illegality, criminality, and the other one is the axis of legitimacy, high or low. And I see governance in Latin America, and particularly in Latin American urban areas, as located somewhere on that continuum. So it can be governance that is veering more towards the illegality, criminality end, where, you know, a local neighborhood gang is providing X and Y service to the local population, which can actually be perceived by the local population as being a rather legitimate service provision. So it would be somewhere in my diagram, it would be somewhere on the right upper hand, in the right upper hand corner. Or it can be governance that is actually provided by the state or closer to the state in the public-private partnership, perhaps, such as Transmilenio in the bus rapid transit system in Bogota, which would be more towards the end of legality. But since the system is completely overloaded and people are stuck in those buses as if they were, in a can, this public service provision, even though further towards the end of legality, actually would be characterized by rather low legitimacy. So it would be somewhere in the left, below left-hand corner. What this diagram is, this figure is trying to show you is that there is no formal and official dividing line between legality and illegality, criminality in Latin America today. I think this is a rather bold, observation and affirmation, but according to my own empirical experience and my own empirical research in the region, everything in terms of governance, criminal legal governance, is moving always dynamically between these two poles, legality and illegality, criminality, and it can be imbued with either higher or lower levels of legitimacy. So no dividing line. These are my hybrid criminal legal orders. So there are no formal boundaries between legality and illegality or criminality. They're blurred. An array of both state and non-state actors interact and exercise political authority, that is governance. That's my very brief working definition of governance. So they are interacting, coordinating, regulating each other and exercise political authority, but they're both state and non-state, and they can be criminal and non-criminal. And resources are appropriated and order is reproduced through fluid combinations of legal and illegal or criminal means. This is the basic characterization of what I see as the contemporary hybrid criminal legal order in Colombia, which I think acquires particular relevance in the context of big urban centers. This is the idea behind this thinking. I don't have much time to go into it, but we can have either consolidated rational legal orders and contested rational legal orders on the one hand, and on the right-hand side, we would have what I have been talking about thus far, which are the consolidated criminal legal orders and the contested criminal legal orders, where the consolidated is basically a combination of high illegality, criminality, and high legitimacy, which is a strong belief in illegality and criminality. And the contested criminal legal order would be high illegality or criminality, but low legitimacy, which would mean a weak belief in illegality and criminality. What I've been addressing so far is on the right-hand side of this graph, of this picture. So it's two types of criminal legal order. In Cali, how this pans out? Well, very briefly, it happened right under our noses because this is something that affected us directly in the neighborhood that we were living in. In Colombia, municipalities have a municipal territorial zoning plan. It's called the POT in Spanish. This is a legal base, and urban development should happen on the basis of the POT in every municipality. However, what happens is that in order to get around the pot or use the pot for their own particular purposes, local economic and social elites bargain with the mayor's office and the city council to obtain illegal construction permits. Now, in the particular case of Cali that we witnessed, the mayor himself had rather high stakes in the construction industry. And city councillors were enticed by monetary and social incentives to approve changes to the POT, to the POT, the Municipal Territorial Zoning Plan, even though that could not have been done legally at the time. But nonetheless, the idea was we have to change the legal base in order to get our construction permits, in order to continue with our investments and so on. The enticements that I'm referring to here to councillors, yes, I mean, it can be plain corruption, money changes hands, but there are also social incentives. That's very important in Latin America. It's, you know, if you, council person number one, help me, construction shark number two, to get this license so I can build my high-rise block, then I will actually, you know, recommend your son for a very good school in the south of Cali. If you don't do it, then I'm sorry, I can't help you with your son in that very good school. So it is also this social pressure, you know, people want to attend those schools, and it's the elite who is basically, you know, playing the role of gatekeepers to that sort of educational institution. So it's not just money, but it's also what I call social incentives. Illicit payments and other types of retribution to councillors flow, and the POT is amended in line with the requests from the construction sharks and also likely the mayor. So the license for a high-rise apartment block or blocks is issued despite the precinct's insufficient public services, which we checked and were absolutely, I mean, this whole amendment of the pot was in violation of the environmental and social utility provision in that area. Nonetheless, the license is issued. And now this is important in the Latin American context, as you really do have serious and organized crime in its many manifestations across the region, and particularly in urban areas. Now in Cali, which is a hotspot for drug trafficking still, human trafficking too, and other illegal criminal activities, the illegal criminal proceeds from drug trafficking are then actually whitewashed through the purchase of luxury apartments, such as the ones that were built right in front of our apartment, and which were based on the amendment of the POT on the basis of what was most likely an illegal or at least an illicit license. So the outlook, and coming really to a close, my time is certainly up, is I believe that we should look at big city governance in Latin America through the lens of criminal legal governance. I think it is a phenomenon that many people have sort of seen. It's happening, it's moving, it's unfolding. What I have done simply is to give it a name. I have called it criminal legality. I've called it criminal legal governance, and I have provided it a conceptual foundation. Now, I think we can fruitfully use the concept of criminal legality and criminal legal governance to drill more down into issues of urban big city governance in Latin America. I believe that we would find, when we do this, that the innovations that I have described briefly at the beginning of my talk are, of course, they're interesting, they're well-meaning, they're important and everything, but they probably are falling short of providing improvements to big city governance in Latin America, precisely because of the element of criminal legality. So citizen participation in oversight and municipal budgeting, proximity policing, or substitutive security governance through the formal strengthening of regulations, state presence, and the rule of law All of these are likely to be quite elusive and, in the end, ineffective if we don't take into consideration these other dynamics that I have tried to capture under the notion of criminality. So we're faced with an issue of decriminalization, really, at the local and national levels in Latin America. Big area of work to be done. How can we actually understand and operate the notion of decriminalization? What I would suggest is that it certainly would imply, this decriminalization, a deep social, normative, but also moral change in a region such as Latin America. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I would certainly most appreciate your comments.
Thank you so much for a very interesting and sobering presentation. And I would now invite Dr. Jeffrey Peller.
Great. Thank you very much. That was really a fascinating presentation. And thank you, Nazia, for organizing this wonderful event. I'm really lucky to be a part of it. Today, I'm going to present to you about the contentious politics of African urbanization. And I'm really glad that Nazia presented this intro because I will talk a little bit about the tension that we see with the movement of people to urban areas, as well as the recategorization of growing rural spaces. So the urbanization that we see on the African continent. But I'll be clear that it's not always a violent process, but definitely a contentious process. So I'm going to start with kind of the big picture trends that we're seeing across the African continent, because it's really one of the most important structural changes that is occurring, the challenge of rapid urban growth. So what we've seen in the last 60 years or so is the increase of people living in urban areas from 27 million people in 1950 to about 560 million people today. And that might be a conservative estimate. By 2050, it's projected to be 950 million people are expected to be living in urban areas. And this, it could even be much larger than that. According to the Africopolis, which is a wonderful initiative coming out of the OECD, there are now over 7,600 urban agglomerations. So areas that we could categorize as urban areas of more than 10,000 people. More than 65 cities have 1 million people or more. And something that's, I think, relevant to our discussion is that nearly half of all these people are living in slum-like conditions. Some of these are full neighborhoods that are informal settlements and squatter settlements. Others are, pockets within other neighborhoods. This is also taking place in parallel with a youth bulge, a huge population boom across the continent. There's expected to be 2.5 billion people in Africa by 2100. Countries like Nigeria are expected to hit 1 billion people in the next 80 years or so, overtaking the United States as the third largest country in the world. And cities like Lagos are projected to reach 40 million people or so, Kinshasa 20 to 30. So some of these cities are really growing quite large. It's important to note that not all of these cities or the growth is not happening only in mega cities, not only in capital cities. In fact, most of the growth is happening in what the UN calls secondary cities, or cities that are under 300,000 people, but they're growing rapidly. Many of these are actually in the interior of the country. As you can see on these maps, cities kind of grew along the coast because they were trading centers, and then the role of colonialism really created kind of extractive cities. But we start seeing the growth of populations in cities like Kano and Nigeria and other places more inland. You can really see the massive growth in urban agglomerations in this map right here. This is a map of what I was mentioning about the population of the percentage of the urban population that lives in slum-like conditions. And you can see that in some cities, over 60% of the population in urban areas are living in conditions of substandard housing, lack of access to water, insecure tenure, really high, dense, overcrowded spaces. You can see right there that the African continent has the most. So as people are moving into these spaces, the governments don't have the resources or the capacity to deliver the services that people need. So this really forces neighborhoods and individuals themselves to take matters into their own hands. So I just want to point out four kind of characteristics of the urbanization process that I think are unique to Africa, although we do see interesting parallels with Latin America, Asia, and other places. So the first is that the urbanization is really happening without large-scale industrialization. So rather than large-scale industry and manufacturing pulling people from the countryside, the urbanization really was pushed by failures of agricultural policy and structural adjustment policies in the 1980s and 90s, in addition with major conflicts and civil wars on the continent. And now, as countries begin to industrialize, most people are still coming to the cities and engaging in number two, which is informal economic activity, which really dominates urban life. So, more than 90% of people in many of these cities are engaged in the informal economy activity outside of state regulation. I would argue that politics also happens in informal and unofficial spaces. The third is that we cannot think about African urbanization without the impact of colonialism, primarily due to two major reasons. One is that you see capital cities often become primate cities, where you have economic, political, administrative, and cultural power all concentrated in one particular city. And they're so much larger than any other city in the country. So these are cities like Nairobi, Lagos, which are just hugely dominant powerhouses. The second aspect is, especially with countries that were heavily influenced by colonialism, there's racialized urban planning, which segregated the populations. And then in the post-colonial development trajectory, the native elites moved into these kind of more previously white spaces, and poor people settled in the slums. But we can really point to the segregation emerging out of this racialized urban planning, a lot of which had to do with protection from disease. So Maynard Swanson calls this the sanitation syndrome, trying to separate the dirty poor populations from white settlers or white administrators. And then the fourth is that these cities have ambiguous property rights and land governance regimes. And I don't think we can think about the urbanization process without thinking about the lack of clear private property or state property rights in these places, which really sets it apart from cities in China, cities in Japan, cities in other kind of Western industrialized cities. So this presents numerous challenges, as you can imagine. The type of poverty that we see in African cities is different from rural areas. So the food insecurity is different. Sanitation is a huge issue, lack of housing and unemployment. But this also presents incredible opportunities for governments to find new bases of support, leaders to mobilize new followers, political parties to build new organizational apparatuses and political machines, and residents really to gain new, have access to housing or urban space that they wouldn't have. But this also, and so you can see on the left here, that these issues often are at the forefront of politics. You see the top picture is in South Africa with organizations fighting for dignity. Sanitation is dignity. Sanitation is a human right. And then the bottom picture is a public toilet in Ghana. But these public toilets are often captured by local political parties and cause a sort of toilet wars for power to control these spaces. So what happens is political parties will capture these areas and take money from people to use them, and it becomes a cash cow to run their political campaigns. So you can see how basic services become heavily politicized in these cities. And you have what leads to multiple and competing claims on an urban space. So on the one hand, you have people claiming multiple claimants on the same piece of land due to a long history of land being kind of transferred between different actors, but also diverse social institutions, different traditional authorities, chieftaincies, gangs, pastors, churches, imams, and Islamic organizations, all competing against one another for kind of power and authority in the local neighborhood. So when we, the project that I'm working on now tries to think about these issues on a continent-wide scale. And we see different patterns emerge. So one of the things that I've done is borrow from the contentious politics literature, scholars like Charles Tilley and Sidney Tarrow, to use some of their language to understand the mechanisms of contentious politics. So we see new attributions of threat and opportunity. So threats to political control, threat to urban displacement, new opportunities for land speculation as the price of property in these areas rises. We have existing organizations become reappropriated. So we see the reemergence of ethnic associations that really lay dormant for the last 20 or 30 years. The reemergence of traditional authorities who might have been living abroad for 20 or 30 years and kind of return to the space and claim customary ownership in order to then be able to sell that land for a high price. You see membership in human rights organizations like Slum Dwellers International and Amnesty International, providing opportunities for people on the ground. You see the framing and reframing of identities, so the construction of new insider, outsider cleavages, host migrant, native newcomer identities, and people making claims to new types of urban citizenship. The phrase, the right to the city, something that didn't really exist in the language of African urban dwellers, is starting to be used as some of these issues become globalized and as international organizations move into some of these spaces. You have innovative forms of collective action, protest, construction of slum dweller associations, land occupations, very similar to what we see in some of the Latin American cities, and new forms of brokerage. So political clientelism and patronage, interest and connections with the diaspora, and NGOs kind of capturing some of this activity as well. So I think it's useful now to zoom in to what this looks like at the very local level. And I'm just gonna read to you the two opening vignettes of my book that looks at some of these things in the context of urban Ghana, in Accra and a city called Ashima. So on a rainy day in a notorious poor neighborhood, a drunk driver drove his truck into an electricity pole. A blackout ensued and the entire neighborhood went without power. As water flooded the muddy roads, a respected landlord rushed to the scene to calm tempers. A group of residents followed, arguing and deliberating about what should be done. Some of them threatened to beat up the driver. They debated whether to send the driver to the police station, knowing that if he were charged, he would not be able to pay for a new pole. He worked for a known big man in town, causing concern that he had influence over the police. Filing a complaint with the electricity company would take too long. The municipal assembly and police officers were ineffective. Community members had to resolve the issues themselves. 20 residents, including the local assemblyman, landlords, and the owner of the vehicle, respected and legitimate authorities called opinion leaders in Ghana, piled into a local store and came up with a plan. The owner of the vehicle was pressured to pay for most of the new pole, while residents contributed a small amount. The assemblyman drove straight to the utility company to demand they fix the pole immediately. Residents were able to hold their leaders to account and get them to do their jobs, contributing to collective decision-making and community governance. By the early evening, electricity was restored to the entire neighborhood. This outcome was even more surprising because the neighborhood is ethnically diverse, highly impoverished, and has weak and often ineffective formal institutions. In contrast to other neighborhoods, Ashima has responsive and effective leaders, a robust public sphere that facilitates community decision-making, and a multi-ethnic civic life. But this is not the case in all neighborhoods across the city. In fact, in another city neighborhood called Old Padama, the neighborhood's constantly under the threat of forced evictions. And the forced evictions actually bring the community together to fight this eviction. But in 2011, local leaders decided that instead of having the local government carry out the eviction, they would do it themselves. This would enable them to protect their own houses and seek, control the process and, put money in their own hands. In the end, all it did was simply displace certain residents in the community and serve the private interests of these local leaders. So what I've spent the last, 5+ years coming up with is a way to understand why it is that certain neighborhoods are better governed than others. And what I found is that it comes down to the different ways that locals understand urban space and how those governance structures interact with state and formal institutions. So in places like Old Padama, people see state goods, housing, state resources as private goods, whereas in places like Ashima, they see them as common or public goods. And what this does is when municipal authorities seek to work in these spaces, they come into contact with the local governance structures, and either the local governance structures substitute for the state, or they can complement the state in the case of Ashima. And there's kind of three major aspects that are important: how ethnicity plays out in these places, the role of local leaders, and the types of local leaders. So in the successful case, you have local legitimacy, where teachers, religious leaders, landlords, early settlers have really lived in this community for a long time and view their role as kind of building up the community for the public good, rather than using it for their own private interests. And I argue that these two steps contribute to the possibilities for sustainable urban development. If we're talking about combating climate change, if we're talking about improving sanitation measures, all of the things that the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to do, we actually have to think about the interaction between the informal governance that's happening and the formal governance structures that exist. So I borrow from some classic collective action frameworks to think about urban space within that framework. And how urban space itself is not always viewed as a public good, and it's not always viewed as a private good, but sometimes it's viewed as a common or club good. And this is the typology that I developed, and I think is worth thinking about, in Ghana, in West Africa, but also, contexts across the global South and perhaps even the global North. It was helpful to see the presentation before about how politicians are thinking about, land and urban planning along, to serve their private interests. And I wonder if there's some similarities. In the African context, this is there's a historical story here. So a lot of this can be explained by the different settlement patterns that emerge, and this really shapes understandings of ownership and legitimacy. So I don't have time to get into this, but you see a strong importance to indigenous and people who claim original inhabitants in these areas. So in places like Lagos and places like Accra, the landowners who are indigenous to the territory have extreme power, and some of the neighborhoods are dominated by these structures, whereas stranger settlements like Ashima, there's an agreement between host and migrant relationships that provide the basis for better governance moving forward, a hybrid governance structure that I think works. And this also translates on to the successful provision and access to public goods. So one of the things that I did in my research was collect quantitative data on 150 local spots where we created an index for public provision, management, and access. So we went to local public toilets to assess, how well they were maintained. Was there toilet paper thrown everywhere? Did they smell terribly? Or were they well cleaned and people felt comfortable using them? And I noticed that in those places where you have complementarity between local decision making and the state, there's like in these stranger settlements that I call them, you have much higher scores on the access and management to public services. So some of the policy prescriptions that come out of this research is that we do have to think about the politics, because the contentious process of urbanization is real, and it's how people are understanding these issues on the ground. And we have to be creative about how we're thinking about policy. So the first suggestion is to strengthen mechanisms of accountability, specifically ways to bring politicians and leaders and their constituents together on a daily basis and have them engage in discussions. The second is state legal recognition, but not in the way that Hernando de Soto talks about, not simply distributing title, but rather recognizing whole neighborhoods so that they can invest in their own communities. And third is being creative with in situ upgrading. So creative infrastructure upgrades on a very small scale. And I'll just leave with a story that kind of reflects some of the things that we see. So in 2012, there was a fire outbreak that occurred in Old Fadama, the neighborhood that I describe as not so well governed. And more than 100 structures burned down. You can see some of the pictures here. People lost all of their belongings. They lost everything. Within a few days, there was a collective effort to clean up the community. You saw the women and children and the young men all working together to clean up and put the fire out, and also, you see here, take all the ashes to the garbage and kind of clear out the space. I returned to this space in about a week or two after the fire occurred, and this is what we saw. The neighborhood being completely rebuilt with no help from the formal government. And as I talked to some of the people there, I asked them, how did you get the go ahead to rebuild? What was in place? And they said, well, the leaders came together and said that anyone who had the means to rebuild would rebuild. And if they didn't have the means, they could sell their property to people who did have the means. But what you notice here is that they're building in concrete blocks, something that was not the case when the structures were raised down and were in plywood. And within a few weeks, the neighborhood was completely rebuilt in concrete blocks, calling into question the theories from people like Hernando de Soto that people will not invest in homes if they don't have property title, that slum dwellers don't have the money to invest in proper formal housing, which forces us to kind of think about what it means to be permanent and what it means to upgrade in these spaces. And I think we need to think deeply about how local understandings of power and local decision-making structures can help with this process. And I'll end there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was a very engaging presentation. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Shultze-Kraft. So I encourage people to please ask questions and put them in the chat box. But I'll get the ball rolling. As I heard both of you go in depth about urbanization in Latin America and Africa, there's so much to talk about, but I think with Markus, what I remembered was consolidated criminal order and contested criminal order. And then Jeff talked about toilet wars and a very graphic, one cannot forget this, and contentious politics. And so when we think about cities, we think about, the sustainable development, we talk about good governance. You two, as being experts, do you think that we should retire these frameworks of good governance and fragile cities and, basically indicators like a checklist of things that need to happen when what you're showing to us is that crime has entrenched itself, illegality is no longer contested in some places, and Jeff, as you point out, that informal governance is a reality. So I wondered, what's your take on these policy terms that we keep engaging with? And both of you.
I'll start. Great question. I don't have a problem with getting rid of these terms, sustainable development, governance. I think they're useful to bring the policy community together, bring foreign governments together. But what I do think is important is understanding that these are outcomes. Governance, sustainable development is an outcome. And in my perspective, they're an outcome of a political process. They are inherently political. So if we're talking about, good governance being apolitical, then yes, we should get rid of it. But if governance simply means, access to decision making, and the goal is to get everyone involved in the decision making process, sure, we should think about the conditions that enable that to happen. Similar to sustainable development and the goal to make inclusive cities. I mean, those should be goals, but that that's a goal that we need to reach, and we have to think about the routes of how to get there. And I think both of our presentations in different ways speak to the conditions under which these things can be achieved.
Yes, if I could just add here, thanks much, Jeff. And thanks much, Nazia. I think, it's a matter of really looking at what's going on the ground. I mean, we need more grounded analysis. We need, as you have done it, Jeff, most interesting, as I've tried to do it in Latin America. We really need to get out there and take a look at what's going on in terms of political relationships, in terms of power relationships. A colleague and friend of mine, Robin Lachem, talks about these issues as real governance, as opposed to good governance. I mean, let's get real about governance, basically, in our analysis. At the same time, I should say, when it comes to development, when it comes to issues of policy, how can we go about finding ways to address serious issues that sometimes even make a difference in terms of life and death for people. So these are serious issues. what is our normative compass? You know, what is it that we actually should want to see? And in a way, you know, this whole debate about good governance and also fragility, you know, these are terms that have a strong normative background. And I think we should probably not necessarily let go entirely of this normative background and vision, because somehow we need something, because otherwise we might get ourselves buried as realists in, you know, in the grounded fields of this world. So we need some sort of, you know, normative compass. But again, having said this, we need to reflect on it. You know, what should this normative compass be, and why? What are the grounds? You know, when I talk about we need moral change in Latin America in order to somehow deal with criminality, then this is, you know, a strong toolbox. This needs to be substantiated and thought through really well, but it should not obstruct our view on the necessity of thinking normatively too.
Thank you so much, both of you. We have a question from one of our participants. Do you analyze the structure of social capital for the formation of order in urban communities? What are the roles of religions, customs, ethnicity, ethics, etc.? If either of you wants to go first.
I responded to this in the comments as well. Yeah, my book pays very close attention to the role and structure of associational life. And I'm very interested in why some communities are kind of more ethnically segmented, where people from different groups don't engage with one another on a daily basis. So I really root this in daily engagement. And I do this both qualitative and quantitatively. But the story that I tell for the more successful community is that there's a long history of engagement between different ethnic groups that date back to colonial times, where early settlers were forced to engage with the indigenous population, but also new migrant groups. And in order to kind of gain power and resources from the state, they were forced to kind of form coalitions and come together to stave off evictions, but also to garner resources. So there's a political logic to bringing them together. I think there's also a religious story in some of these places. So many of these communities are groups of people from the north, and they're mostly Muslim, and they speak a common language of Hausa. And I think this is something that, you know, in the West African context, is a long kind of tradition and literature on this, but you see it playing kind of important role in governance in what are called Zongo settlements or stranger settlements in Ghana.
I think in the case of the work that I'm doing on criminal legal governance, criminality in Latin America, but also West Africa, Nigeria particularly, of course, I would respond to this interesting comment. Yes, customary law, non-state law, you know, religious foundations, institutional legal foundations are part of what I would see as the issues of legal pluralism. And I do think that criminality as being one manifestation of, I call it unlaw. Unlaw is a product of criminality, is one manifestation of legal pluralism. And I think, yes, we need to connect it in our work to thinking about law and customary law, including faith-based law. Sharia, for example, in Nigeria is, of course, important here. But this, in my case, this needs to be done empirically as of yet.
Thank you, both of you. I think there's so much to ask, but let me just start with Markus. In other of your papers, you talk about violence in Latin America, which does not really end up in civil conflict. And I think that's fascinating, because violence in some cities in Latin America rivals war zones. I wondered, are you paying attention to these emergent challenges coming from resource scarcity, climate change, and so on? And in places where there's contested criminal legal orders, where they have consolidated, are there any, prediction is a wrong word, but I wondered what could you project or what you might think of that, the effect?
Yeah, thank you, Nazia. Well, you know, being after all, in a way, a realist at heart, you know, I mean, resource scarcity, misappropriation of rents from natural resources, for example, oil bunkering, illegal oil bunkering in Nigeria, or, you know, the whole huge rising illicit illegal mining, gold mining, and other mining industries in Colombia and other parts of Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. We could give so many examples. I mean, all of these are embedded in one way or another, and to a larger extent than another, in criminal legal orders. So there will always be, you know, this fetishism for the law, as Komarov and Komarov call it, in African countries, in Latin American countries. So the legal law, as it were, the state law, will be the basis on which to build illegal and illicit enterprises. And the appropriation of resources and the degradation of the environmental and, you know, the environment in the process, promoting climate change, etc., is certainly something that we need to be aware of. So, you know, if you want to push me, because I haven't thought this through at all, but criminal legality could well be a driver of, you know, biodiversity degradation, and as such, for you know, a serious environmental problem. And again, at the core of the issue here seems to be that it is particularistic, individual, particularistic, sectorial, you know, appropriation, misappropriation of resources and rents, and I think we do need to get to a new understanding of what the common good actually in this world today could mean, because frankly, I don't quite see it.
Thank you. That's much to think about. Thank you for indulging me. And then from Jeff, I would pose the same question, but slightly bring it back to your presentation, because you talked about the contentious politics frameworks. And I find it interesting that you link that with informal governance. And I wondered, in your observation as well, do you see this contentious politics going the traditional way, which Tilly et al., you know, they call it social movements and protests, where the state is one of the contenders. But we see here that the state is not entirely separate from the informal. So if you could elaborate a bit on that.
That's a great point. And I do think it's probably one of the limitations of his framework. And one of the big differences between the kind of old work I was doing on the politics of daily life, everyday life, and new work on kind of forced evictions, where the state plays a central role in the story. But there's no clear distinction between formal and informal politics. And I think I'm not going to pretend that I have an answer to that, but I think I need to think that through, of how can we adapt Tilly's framework for a context where, you know, the struggle versus the state might not be the most useful thing that we're trying to explain. So I'm just going to stop there, but thank you for bringing that up. I think it's really important.
Thank you. There's one question about the effect of globalization on urbanization in Africa and Latin America, and also a little bit about the current pandemic.
So in my case, the cities are globalizing rapidly, and what's interesting, capital is coming from all sorts of different places. You see the importance of cities like Dubai shaping new models of urban planning. You see the impact of China. So you have all sorts of different actors. You see the importance of Turkey and kind of East African cities, especially like Mogadishu, and rebuilding a city after war. So global capital is huge. Facebook just, mentioned that they're opening an office in Lagos. They already have an office, I think, in Johannesburg. So you have, big tech moving in. This is really, changing the face of cities. You have this obsession with kind of an urban fantasy, kind of gated cities, new cities, smart cities, whatever you want to call them, which in a lot of ways are just reproducing inequalities and leading to demolitions and forced evictions. So that plays a big role in this kind of contentious politics story. The point about, I'll let Markus answer, and I forgot the second part of the question.
Yeah, thanks. Globalization and urbanization in Latin America. Well, if you may permit, I will again focus on the illicit side of things. Yes, a big impact of illicit globalization on urbanization in Latin America. I mean, whole new neighborhoods are being built, part of these high-rise apartment blocks that I spoke about can be mentioned here, but across Mexico City, across Guadalajara, across Bogota, across Lima, across, anywhere you look really, you see an enormous activity in terms of urban development, and much of that is financed illicitly. Bogota changed its urban face since, well, I'm almost tempted to say since I arrived there in 2002, but that could be, misunderstood. I didn't have to do with it, I just observed it. It's unbelievable what they have been doing. And, if you look into the details, if you really take the trouble to understand how these kinds of luxury developments can be financed across huge cities such as Bogota, there is no other way of looking at it and answering it by saying, well, this must be illicit finance. A lot of money we know has been repatriated to Colombia in the 2000s from the US. The same is happening in Mexico. So yes, globalization, but in terms of illicit, and illegal globalization, you can see it on every street corner in Latin America.
Thank you. One question for me, for both of you. I think for people who are not as versed in Latin America or in Africa, because we have participants who are also working on specific issues. So any takeaway from both of you about urbanization? What do you see the prospects in Latin America, in Africa? And also in terms of I think for me personally, in terms of the increasing inequality, which we see the current pandemic has laid bare, much of that in many cities, including in the global north. So anything for us who are not as steeped in your expertise?
If I may jump in on a very personal note, I came back with my family last year from Colombia to Europe, to Germany. And you can't believe the joy we have been living since we are back in Berlin. Because it's a city where we can walk, where our daughter can, get outside and jump on a bicycle and have a sidewalk and even a bicycle lane where she can cycle. We can move about without always looking over our 2 or 3 or 4 shoulders. And it is really a completely different sensation of urban life, which I had almost forgotten about because I had been living for so long in Latin American cities. So what I can say in response to this question about a perspective is that it will be extremely hard to get a grasp on the large urban areas in places such as Latin America. It will be extremely hard. The segregation, the fragmentation, and the exclusion that characterizes these places, these sites, is so deep and is so palpable, on a daily basis that I know, I mean, people are doing a great job. I mean, there are great urban planners, there are great mayors. We have a fantastic new woman mayor, Claudia Lopez in Bogota, who is doing her utmost to, for example, deal with the COVID situation, which has hit Colombia extremely hard. By somehow, yes, offering an urban response, of how to keep your distance in such a mega city to other people, how you can somehow manage public space in a city such as Bogota in order to reduce the incidence of COVID, which has unfortunately not really happened. The country is really very hard hit. So I'm not saying that there aren't people who are trying, but the battle is absolutely uphill. And I think COVID brings to the fore some of the enormous weaknesses of urban space in Latin America when compared to Berlin, for example, again, or German cities. I mean, we have the luxury, and I'm always saying that to anybody who asks, to actually go outside and visit a park. That's not possible in great, stretches of, be it Cali or be it Bogota or other Latin American cities. So I see the major challenges, and I want to note, that we have to be realistic about what can be done.
Thank you.
I'll be a bit more optimistic, and the reason I'm a bit more optimistic is because I think something's happening politically on the African continent. So while many people are celebrating the urbanization story to mean that democracy is going to come to the continent, this is the end of ethnic politics, this is the end of clientelism, that's certainly not the case. It's not such a linear story, but we do see cities being the places where the most interesting political experiments are happening, where we see the street as producing new forms of political mobilization, where we see new types of politicians, politicians in their 30s and 40s coming from the poorest neighborhoods in society, rising to power in places where the same president's been in power for 20, 30, 40 years, like Uganda and in Zimbabwe before Mugabe died, and these sorts of places. And some of the most interesting mobilization, the gender dynamics, the role of women in politics is happening in these cities. And I do think that this is going to shape democracy, it's going to shape party building, it's going to shape politics fundamentally. And I'm much more optimistic. I don't think it's just modernization theory where everything gets better and everyone becomes a Democrat and economic growth happens. Certainly not, but I'm much more positive. And I think the COVID story, you asked about COVID, certainly has affected the poor informal settlements more. But what we also see in the African cases is that they were actually much better prepared because they had practices in place to deal with contact tracing due to histories of other epidemics like Ebola. They had national strategies in place, and in places like Senegal, I mean, you couldn't get through the airport without being tested. And a lot of this is being driven by, stuff that's happening in these cities, the capabilities of these cities, people moving back. The cities are where diaspora populations, people who fled in the 1970s and 1980s, now they're going back and living in these places. So I don't want to celebrate an Africa rising narrative. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I do think it's exciting for an experimental purpose.
Thank you to both of you. I see daybreak in Berlin and from the window. And thank you so much, Jeff. It's 10:30, I assume, in San Francisco. It was a real pleasure to hear from both of you, a real treat. I would end on the hopeful note that as long as we keep producing grounded research, there is hope. We bring stories to policymakers, and we try to bring a little bit of understanding in very complicated, complex urban contexts. And for that, I thank you from myself and my institute. And I hope we can meet again in person at some point. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Nazia.
Yes, thank you. This is really excellent. And thank you to all of you in the audience who sat through this and listened to us.
Yeah, same for me. Thanks to all in the audience and everybody who took the time to listen to us. It was really fascinating for me. Thank you.